Okay, so to start things off, my name is Dr. Leah Q Peoples, and I am one of the lead researchers around the Culture Responses Sustaining STEAM Curriculum Scorecard, and I'm so excited to present it today. The scorecard officially launched last month in February, but today is an amazing opportunity to actually walk through the scorecard, talk about some of the different components of it, how we created it, and things of that nature. During this presentation, you'll notice a couple features on your Zoom screen. You should see a Q&A box at the very bottom. So because there are so many attendees, we're not able to open the chat and we're not able to moderate the chat. So if you have any questions that you want us to answer, you can put them in the Q&A section right at the bottom of the screen. And what we'll do is try to answer those questions as we go throughout the presentation, okay? So with that being said, let's get started with acknowledging some of the space that we hold today. It's really important to kind of ground and frame where this work takes place because it's ultimately related to how we understand and see the world and position ourselves, and then draw these connections between culture responses, sustaining education, and STEAM subjects. And so we, Education Justice Research and Organizing Collaborative, and all of our amazing panelists who are joining us today are based in New York City, which is currently stolen Lenape land. And we want to acknowledge and recognize the plight of Indigenous and Native people who continue to fight for their rights to exist, land rights, and basic human rights. This history of colonization undergirds the very need for culture responses sustaining STEAM curriculum. If you want to know more about land acknowledgement and where it is, what land you reside on, you can go to that link at the very bottom of the screen as well. There's also going to be a couple of links throughout the presentation that will take you to a public folder that includes all the slides and includes any resources and materials we'll be talking about today, etc. You will all be able to access that right inside of that public file. Okay, so we're going to get started by setting up what we can expect from today's webinar. So first of all, welcome. I'm really glad that you all were able to join us today. Today's objective is just to review and introduce the scorecard. So we will not be doing in-depth learning, an in-depth learning experience around culture responsive STEAM. And what I mean by that is we won't fully unpack what does it mean to do culture responsive STEAM in classrooms? What does it look like in science, in math, in arts, and technology? And we also will not actually be evaluating curriculum today. We will only be looking at the scorecard tool itself and like how we can use it and exploring how it was developed, etc. If you are interested though in a more in-depth learning experience through a training or a professional development, maybe if you want to invite us to your school or to your community organization to do an evaluation or scoring party, or if you just have additional questions in general, there's a slide at the very end that has contact information, and you can just reach out to us and we can discuss some of those ways we can work together and collaborate. So the agenda for today is that we're going to start with introductions. Myself and my colleagues will introduce ourselves, and then you all will have an opportunity to also share a little bit about who's in the audience. We'll be talking about a little bit about the background of CRSC and CRSC STEAM, and then we'll have a short panel discussion followed by a scorecard overview and use. So I'm going to start off by asking each panelist, starting with Tahia, to introduce themselves. Each person has about 30 seconds to say who they are, their pronouns, the work that you do, or your connection to culture responsive and sustaining STEAM. Tahia.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. My name is Tahia Islam. I use she, hers pronouns. First and foremost, I'm a product of New York City Public Schools, and I was helping research and organize with Metro Center and CEJ when the scorecard was developed. And now I work in political education at the People's Forum in New York City.
Thank you. And Jasmine.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Ma. My pronouns are she, hers. I'm faculty in the Department of Teaching and Learning at NYU. And my research is primarily concerning kind of this narrow band that we say this is what mathematics is in school and how deeply problematic and historically oppressive that's been. And I'm gonna use the rest of my 30 seconds to say everybody should cheer their brains out for Leah and Tahia and Timothy for all of the hard work that they did taking the lead on this thing. It's like an incredible thing. And if we could like get up on stage and give you flowers, that's what we'd be doing right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Next, let's go to Timothy. We might be having some technical difficulties. We'll come back. Let's go to Jose.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jose Vilson, and before I started my current work, I was a 15-year math teacher in Washington Heights. Shout out to Inwood, shout out to the Heights, teaching middle school mathematics from 6th to 8th grade. I'm currently a doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University, studying sociology and education for EBSA. Hi.
All right, and again, my name is Leah Peoples. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the research director at the Education Justice Research and Organizing Collaborative and one of the authors on the scorecard. And Timothy, I don't know if you are having difficulty, but I just want to pause for a moment to see if you want to hop on and introduce yourself. Okay, well, we'll come back when he has a chance to come back on. All right, so now it's an opportunity to find out who's in the room with us today. So I'm going to start a Zoom poll. You should see it pop up on your screen. And there are 7 questions that we're asking folks to respond to. 1, where are you from? 2, what is your racial ethnic background? 3, what is your primary role today? 4, which STEAM subject do you have most interest in? 5, what is your gender? 6, how much do you know about culture responsive and sustaining education? And finally 7, how often do you implement culture responsive and sustaining practices in STEAM education? So take a moment, respond to these questions. This helps us to kind of calibrate the presentation and get a sense of like who's in the room, how in detail we want to go for some areas, and maybe we can keep other areas more general and just trying to get a sense of where people are at. So we've got lots of responses coming in. It looks like a good majority is from the East Coast, a little bit of folks, a few folks from the Midwest, a mixed group around racial and ethnic backgrounds. We've got mostly educators and education organizers, okay, and other, welcome, welcome. And in terms of folks who are interested in STEAM subjects, we have STEAM as an interdisciplinary field, science, some math folks, some arts folks. Shout out to all of you all. Okay. We've got a lot of girls and women on the line. Shout out to everybody. Welcome, welcome. Okay, and there's a good mix for how familiar folks are with culture response and sustaining education. All right. So I'm gonna allow this to run for about 10 more seconds and then cut the poll off, and we're gonna jump right in. All right, I've shared the poll results. You can take a look at it if you like, but in the meantime, we're gonna keep it pushing. Yep, and we covered this, you can keep going. All right, so I want to give a little bit of background about where the scorecard came from. If you didn't know, we had a different version. We started with a different version of the scorecard for English language arts, and that was released sometime in 2019. And a lot of that work came directly from working with organizers around education justice, specifically the Coalition for Educational Justice, based in New York City. So we had organizers who, brought this question of like, how do we know when curriculum is culture responsive? How do we know when we see it? What will it look like? How do we measure it to know whether or not there's been any growth or if it's occurring in schools? So we wrote the first curriculum. You can find it on our website. And right after hosting so many different scoring parties on ELA, in ELA classrooms across the country, there were a lot of questions about, well, what about STEAM? What about science? What about math? What about history? But I think the biggest request really came from the STEAM community. So we started to proceed with a culture responsive sustaining version, of a version of the scorecard specifically for STEAM. You can go ahead to, yep. So this is just a photo that I grabbed from one of the events from the organizers who essentially started this work. And I think that's so important, right? Because this work is grounded and comes from a request from community, right? And so when we're talking about being culturally responsive and about who gets to make these decisions, who gets to ask for our design parts of education and things of that nature, creating a tool that is essentially a community-based evaluation is really necessary to allow multiple people to join in that process of evaluating curriculum. And so we definitely wanted to start with them and acknowledge that they are the ones who really started all of this work. So we're going to do a really brief overview of what is culturally responsive sustaining education. This is going to be brief. So if you want to dive more into this, there are presentation materials that are linked where you can do a little bit more reading, but we're going to go through this pretty quickly. So this definition comes from the New York State Department of Education. A lot of folks are from the East Coast, so you might be familiar with this already. But it's a cultural view of learning and human development in which multiple and intersectional forms of diversity, including race, social class, gender, language, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, ability. If you want to just keep going. And forms of diversity are understood as indispensable sources of knowledge for rigorous teaching and learning. CRSD critically explores the relationships between historical and contemporary conditions of inequality and ideas that shape access, participation, and outcomes for learners. So that's kind of like a really broad definition of what exactly is culturally responsive and sustaining education. And what we're going to do now is talk a little bit about like where that came from. If you have been around for some time, you know that a lot of folks have talked about culturally responsive education and then culturally sustaining pedagogy. And there might've been questions about how did those things come together into culturally responsive sustaining education. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But before I move into this, Tahia, is there anything that you wanna add?
Not at the moment.
Okay, great. So culture responsive and sustaining education is rooted in Gloria Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay's work around culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally relevant teaching. Some key characteristics of CRE include having student-centered instruction, a focus on socio-political consciousness, teachers having high expectations of all students, and cultural competence. A couple of key principles of CRE are validating students' experiences and values and disrupting power dynamics that privilege dominant groups. So again, this is a really brief introduction, but there's way more to learning about what exactly does it mean to be culturally competent and how do we apply this into the classroom. Then when we're talking about the S in culturally responsive sustaining education, it's rooted in the work of Django Paris and Sami T. Alim's work on culturally sustaining pedagogy. This directly addresses deficit thinking, which is essentially looking at different communities, non-dominant communities, in ways that assume the worst about them, falling into stereotypes and kind of these negative images and portrayals of communities. It asserts that the knowledge from students' cultural backgrounds shouldn't be used as leverage for learning in ways that ultimately assimilate students into dominant culture. So a way to think about this is you don't want to use culturally responsive education to bridge to white dominant culture, okay? That's not the point. The point is not to help students assimilate into that, but to be able to hold on to their cultural traditions, et cetera, and essentially build a classroom that's based on pluralistic values, which allows multiple groups from multiple backgrounds to have diverse expressions and ways of knowing and being and doing and learning and all of that. So together, that gives us a culturally responsive sustaining education. So the question now is then, what is culturally responsive sustaining STEAM education? Well, essentially, it's applying a CRSD lens to science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. So one of the most common things that have come up as we were starting these discussions around CRSD STEAM was that science and math is objective. There's no culture involved. There's no way that it can be political, et cetera. And that's a really common misconception. All cultures engage in STEAM. How we engage in STEAM is a direct reflection of our values, our perspectives, the worldviews that we hold, and our thought processes. Notably, there are significant differences between how different cultures enter STEAM. And three examples that I think really show this is thinking about Western ideology and Western approaches to STEAM, indigenous approaches to STEAM, and borderland approaches to STEAM. So I'm gonna kind of break that down really quickly. But Western ideologies essentially look at STEAM, the sciences, the math, et cetera, as having an ultimate truth. There's kind of like this right answer, and it's very much based on white dominant culture. Indigenous approaches to STEAM see STEAM actually as this interdisciplinary, I must be running out of time, interdisciplinary blending of the sciences, the math, et cetera, with actually living in the world, right? Your experience and communicating with each other, the interconnectedness, et cetera. So why are we doing CRSD STEAM? Well, essentially, within the United States, there's a dominant form of STEAM education based on white middle-class Western perspectives of STEAM, despite one, being located on indigenous lands, two, students of color being almost the majority of the school populations, and three, the abundance of STEAM contributions from BIPOC folks and intersecting identities. The omission of scientific histories, theories, contributions, and ways of being and knowing of historically non-dominant students of color in Western schooling context is a form of erasure and epistemic violence. And essentially what that means is that when we are not including different cultural backgrounds into the ways that we teach STEAM and engage STEAM, then it is a form of violence that's happening. It's a form of erasure and violence. So let's get into, we can skip this part so we can get right into the scorecard. If you want to learn more about some of these terms and some of the framing, you can go to either one of these documents. The first is the Racial Politics of STEM, which does a really great background on understanding why we need to have culturally responsive and sustaining education in the STEM fields. And then of course, at the very end of the scorecard, there's a whole bunch of resources by subject that can help you to learn more as well. All right, so now we're going to jump into our panel discussion. And we have 3 questions that we're going to ask each person. You don't have to answer all 3 questions. So I'm just going to ask people to pop in where they feel comfortable. All right. So the first question, why did you join the STEAM? And actually, let me do a little bit of framing. So one of the ways that the scorecard was developed was, one, by using the basis of the ELA scorecard mixed with a literature review of how people were engaging culture responsive and sustaining STEAM, and then actually working with a think tank of educators and practitioners who also use culture responsive practices in their work. So now my question is, why did you join the STEAM think tank? And we'll start with Jasmine.
Thanks, Leah. So for me, I hope it's obvious for you guys listening to Leah talk that anytime she and her team invite you to do something, you say yes. It's worthwhile. And I think that for STEAM, we often talk about things like culturally responsive, culturally sustaining education, but it doesn't mean we really know how to do it. And what we tend to do is we put like ethnic sounding names inside our word problems and have contexts like hip hop, and we think that we've become culturally responsive. And so the deep research that this team has done has allowed us to think beyond kind of representation and really towards ways of knowing. And I think so the opportunity to work with researchers and like this amazing set of classroom teachers to do this work, I think was like an awesome opportunity, and also just like so needed for the field.
Thank you. And I see Timothy has joined us as well. Timothy, if you want to quickly introduce yourself, your name, your pronouns, and how you came to this work. And then if you also want to talk about why you joined the STEAM think tank as well.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Timothy. My pronouns are he, his. The reason, well, I was involved with the STEAM project through EJ-ROC. I was an intern in there at the time, and the STEAM scorecard kind of came about as one of the projects that was being done in the environment, and I was interested in the objective of the card to make education more culturally responsive, especially to communities that don't often or are not reflected in the curriculum that we see in the majority of the public schools. So I thought it was just a really interesting experience and an opportunity to hop on board and kind of, revolutionize the way we think about education in this country. So.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Any other takers before we go on to our second question?
Something for us to consider when it comes to this teamwork is that, this is like intergenerational work. There are those of us who've been fighting for the brilliance of children of color to be, especially our Black and Brown students who make up the vast majority of public school students in our city, forever and a day. I remember when I first started teaching, so much of the conversation was around standardized testing and how kids show up in those very narrow forms of intellectual markers, and how we need to find ways to close achievement gaps uh, according to whatever the white standard norm was, with Asians being the model minority whenever it came to this conversation, without actual regard to like the I guess, intra-racial nuances in that conversation as well. But all the while, like, you had like centuries and millennia of intellectual knowledge that came from ancestral peoples that were not being highlighted in any sort of profound way. And so when I found the chance to at least make a dent in the narrative about how our children show up, what it means to actually be intellectually I guess beneficial, and to bring to the fore all these different intellects and passions and understandings of the world. Like, this is what Black and Brown parents have been fighting for forever and a day in this city. And we finally found the moment for us to actually have those discussions in math. I said, let me go ahead and do that, because like that's really something that we really need to tap into again and again.
Thank you for that. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge one of the questions that popped up in the Q&A. And it comes from an Eric Cromwell, who says, I hear you regarding the white culture dominating how science is taught. How do the next generation science standards perpetuate this issue? And so this is actually a common question that comes up with, like, how does culture responsive and sustaining educational practices filter onto the standards that so many teachers, are using to kind of structure their classrooms and how they are educating students. And this is definitely an ongoing conversation that is continuing about, one, is it necessary to eliminate the standards altogether? Are they fully, problematic in some ways? Or is it a matter of revising and refining them so that they are culture responsive values and principles that are integrated throughout all of these standards? And I just want to invite anyone else, if they have a quick thought on that, on the standards and culture responsive and sustaining education in STEAM, but in particular science. Any other takers?
I just want to say really quickly that it is still an open question to me whether standardization of any kind can possibly be culturally responsive or sustaining. And I say it's an open question, but I lean in a direction. Is no.
Yeah, I think I'm there with you, but I'm also still in the place of questioning that, right? Is there a way to revise it, or do we need to get rid of it altogether and think about this in a really radically different way? Because I want to say what undergirds, the desire to hold on to standards beyond the function of like sorting students and in some ways making the classroom limiting, but the beauty of that also is that students all have a shared knowledge or understanding of particular subjects, or we have like a general sense that we can measure people's performance and what they should do, et cetera. But that can be super problematic, right? Because all of those things are based on values, right? And so how do your values erupt in that? And so we'll just do one more question, and hopefully that answered your question, Eric. The other question I'll ask is, what was it like developing the scorecard through the think tank?
I can speak a little bit to the process and the changes that we've made while developing the scorecard, completely in tandem with the educators you see here, with parents and with community organizers. We tested multiple modules from curriculums from different grades, and we kind of formulated statements and changed them up based on what we were seeing on paper. One of the things that was important was the diligence of the verbiage used, and there's actually a glossary at the end of the scorecard. So we went through a lot of like internal debates on when we're talking about Eurocentric or Western dominant knowledge systems, like what phrasing do we use there? Do we call it a Eurocentric knowledge system? Do we call it a dominant knowledge system? When we're not trying to center that, we're trying to center that we need other forms of knowledge centered, such as Indigenous knowledge systems, Black and African knowledge systems. So there's a glossary at the end of the scorecard. And one other thing I'll say is there's an addition to the scorecard of, after you've scored that section, you can also write down attempts that were made, because we've seen a lot of the curriculums, basically as Jasmine was saying, as an example, you switch out 27 apples divided by 3 apples to 27 empanadas divided by 3 empanadas, but with like no other context provided or affirmation of students' experiences. So that documenting the attempt is important, because are we trying to incline and give credit to those curriculum makers when in reality they didn't have CRSD in mind? So it was a good experience working with the think tank in that way.
Yes, and basically the think tank assembled for quite, I think about 5 or 6 sessions, really getting into these questions about what makes the most sense, how do we do it, etc. And it was really a great process to be involved with. And the last question will go to Jose, and that question is, how does culture responsive to sustaining STEAM show up in your work, and why is it important?
Well, there's a couple things that come up for me when I think about that issue. First and foremost, being the executive director of Educolor, an organization dedicated to race, class, and social justice, I'm considering how so many teachers across the city are thinking about and rethinking about pedagogy, specifically how they're often evaluated on trying to be more culture responsive, but then like the actual policies aren't responsive to that responsiveness, right? And so when we think about the STEAM card, it's a way for us to, recapture the narrative about what it actually means to be a good teacher, what it means to be a responsive teacher, to be one that is thoughtful about community, that's thoughtful about ancestry and the knowledges that students come with. Secondly, I'm also thinking about just my own work in terms of math and how so often, again, like anytime you bring up the idea that math is not neutral, you get any number of different trolls trying to say that we're trying to push a liberal lefty agenda or whatever nonsense I've been about in the last 4 or 5 years. When in fact, all we're really trying to do is say, hey, we want to be included in your math too. Hey, like we actually want to be thoughtful about, the things that our ancestors taught and the ways that our ancestors are thinking about these maths. Like the fact that we say, oh, it's great for students to have multiple pathways, but then once, you start asking Black kids or darker skinned people, oh hey, like what do you think about this math, and they give you a good answer and you're still like, no, that's not white enough, like that's gonna be way out of what we're trying to do here. That's inappropriate. Like that speaks to curriculum and pedagogy, but also white supremacy. And so in the ways that math can be rethought, not as this objective framework for thinking about all these things, but as a conversation in which problem solving arose from things that we did when we try to dissect patterns and look at models and structures. Like that's what math is for so many of us. And just because like our cultures are the dominant culture does not make us the deficit. These are asset-based situations here. So I want to promote for everybody, like this is what the work of the team, especially like Leah, Tahia, and like Tim, like these folks put in the work that we've been trying to verbalize for so long. That's why I'm so proud of this effort, because it's like, oh my gosh, somebody finally put it in a booklet for y'all to finally digest. Like, yes, our work is real, our work matters, our work deserves to be highlighted in this way. And so, shout outs to y'all for really putting in the work, because like, we needed to have this conversation, and we need to have it as the mainstream part, not as just some alternative to, what math is considered to be. But like, no, this is the math. This is the STEAM. This is all the things.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Jose. I agree with everything. So now we're going to actually get into the scorecard, and we're going to go through each of the sections. So we're going to do a scorecard overview, starting with what's actually in the scorecard, the 4 components. So there's an author tally, the representation section, the social justice section, the teaching materials section, and the materials section. So we're going to start off with the author tally. And essentially what we learned is from the ELA scorecard was that you had a lot of stories, and few of them were stories of characters from diverse backgrounds. And when there were stories that feature diverse characters, Black, Indigenous, people of color, they were often written by white people. So imagine you have all of these ELA curriculum, but you're not having BIPOC folks represented in their own voices as told by themselves. So we took that same analysis over to the STEAM version, and we thought it was really important for people to have a sense of who's writing the curriculum. And so this first section, you would actually do a tally of the authors, and that's both by race and ethnicity, as well as by gender. The next section is on representation. And the representation section, at the most symbolic level possible, looks at how representative is curriculum of various backgrounds. And so I have two statements highlighted that I'm going to talk about. The first is the curriculum centers the origins of science, technology, engineering, arts, and/or math within BIPOC communities. That's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So whose origins story are we telling? Are we just leaving at the Big Bang? Or are we exploring some other ways that the world has come into being? And number two is the curriculum elevates mathematicians, artists, and/or scientists with historically marginalized identities, such as non-binary or trans people, women, people of color, people with disabilities, working class people, multilingual people, and their discoveries. So again, at the very base level, this is a symbolic representation. And then Tahia is going to introduce the social justice statements.
Yeah, the social justice section is important because it has to really do with power. We know that STEAM is not the subjective exploration of the mysteries of the universe that Jose was talking about, but it's ancestral, it's rooted in historical discoveries that are tied to societies of people. They're studied to solve challenges affecting human society, or alternatively, to advance certain groups of people for profit or for power. So we wanted to make sure that the social justice system is, as you can see, number 7 here, affirming the knowledge systems of Indigenous, Black, and Brown, non-Western conceptions of science and STEAM. And also, as number 8, using STEAM as a way to understand and improve the world. How is it provoking our students to use STEM to have critical questions, be change agents on the societal status quo, or is it just having them memorize numbers and equations without greater context on how it can be utilized and their power of how systems can be changed, and that the system is marginalizing, but there's power in it, in what the work that can be done. And the next section is, I think, over to Leah again.
Yes, and as you can see, these statements are going to force you to interact with some of these key terms, right? Like, what is the status quo? Acknowledging that, acknowledging your own positionality in that, but also our students' positioning in that, right? And imagining. And so in the teaching materials section, this essentially is how teachers are giving guidance to teach the curriculum. So we know that, you could use a text that might be, older, or maybe like more traditional in the sense of like To Kill a Mockingbird. It seems like a really traditional text that we see a lot of the times. But what matters also is how teachers are instructed to use it. If they're instructing students to be critical about those texts and to really interrogate them and to sit with them in different ways. And so I'm going to read 2 of the statements from the teacher's materials section. The authors of the teacher's materials are people of diverse identities. And number 16, guidance is provided to teachers on being aware of one's biases, assumptions, and the gaps between one's culture and students' cultures. And so this is really important guidance that needs to be in the text. And of course, the idea is not that teachers get all of their information from a singular text or a singular curriculum, but arguably, the text is not complete and full and culture responsive if there's not key guiding pieces within those materials that help them to do that, in the same way that there are other guiding materials. And then finally, Tahia will do the materials section.
The materials and resources are what students have at their disposal, and how the curriculum acknowledges that and makes it accessible. This is an additional section that wasn't in the ELA scorecard because it's really important to have that for STEAM. So the students' materials, their technology, their manipulatives, actually accessible for students, no matter class background. Can students use whatever exists in their household to solve this problem? That the curriculum rigor is not dependent on access to these resources, and that the materials themselves are diverse in nature as well. So you can see, for example, number 27, how can you use accessible technology and manipulatives to explore concepts in ways that reflect a variety of ways of doing. There's many ways in which you can use one manipulative to solve one type of problem, and not just one singular narrative of which things are usually taught.
All right. So those are our 4 sections. We have the author tally, the representation section, the social justice section, the teaching materials section, and the materials section. And usually the way that you would do this, going right into the using the scorecard, is that you would start by getting all of the STEAM curriculum. So you're going to make a decision. Who do you want to be on your evaluation team? Which units do you want to evaluate, et cetera, to assemble that sample? Now, in some cases, people can evaluate their entire curriculum, but that will take probably a couple sessions. And there's nothing wrong with that. You'll just need to be strategic about setting up maybe a session maybe every 2 weeks or once a month, et cetera, to get through a set of curriculum. Another way to do it is to start with a sample set, which is what I was just referring to, where you just pull randomly from a couple different units, and those will be the materials that you evaluate. So you want to get the curriculum, you want to select the evaluation team. This tool was meant to be a participatory evaluation. And what we mean by that is the most beneficial results come from doing this in collaboration with communities. So if there's all teachers in the room evaluating curriculum, the experience is not going to be as rich as it could be if students were included or community members were included, parents and families were included. Those types of conversations and who gets to determine what's culturally responsive, it really cannot be left to mostly white women who make up the most of the teaching force. If you're looking around your room and you're realizing that it's mostly white folks in this room determining how culturally responsive a curriculum is, that's the time to pause and to reevaluate who's on the team, because it's not going to work as well as it would including groups, including community members, students, families, et cetera. And you'll also have to, in some ways, ground teachers to think about their power relations and how they are preparing themselves to be in community, right, with families and students, et cetera. Once you create your evaluation team and you've got all of your units selected, you're going to determine which version of the scorecard you can use. Right now, we have a digital format of the scorecard, which is an Excel sheet. It's super easy to just duplicate each tab, and each person gets their own tab on that digital scorecard, and then go through the statements and put your scores down. Once you've done that, you're going to review the scorecard, pull out any keywords that seem unfamiliar, just to make sure that everyone in the room has a sense of what these statements mean and what do the words in the statements mean. Have key conversations to check for understanding, and so that folks have a sense of what is it that I'm looking for when I go and look and read through this curriculum sample. Next, you will actually conduct the evaluation. You'll read through the sample, and the way that you can do this is in your team, each person has maybe 30 to 45 minutes to review the materials individually, and they can also score individually. And then you can come together as a group and essentially deliberate the scores. What did you get for number 1? What did you get for number 2, et cetera, and why? This process evokes conversation because people will also be required to justify why they scored something a particular way. And it also will highlight the differences, even with teachers who teach the same curriculum. It might even be co-teachers could have very different perspectives on the scorecard. And so really a rich part of this entire process is through that discussion. How did you get satisfactory and I got completely unsatisfied? That's inherently something worth discussing. Once you're done, you'll have your scores, and then you'll discuss it with your team, and you can share the results and decide on what your next steps will be. So what that looks like, though, is you're going to have all the statements on one side of the screen, and then at the very top, there's going to be 4 response options: very satisfied, satisfied, unclear, and not satisfied. And you'll notice that there's numbers underneath each one of those response categories that tells you what number to put into each box. So if you're very satisfied, you're going to write the number 2. If you're just satisfied, 1. If it's unclear, you can't make a determination, -1. And if you're not satisfied, -2. So you'll notice there's no neutral, there's no 0. If it's not culture responsive, then it receives a negative score, right? So if it's not clear, it's a -1, and if it's not satisfactory, it's a -2. Once you have that, you're going to add up all of your columns and you're going to add up all of your scores in each column, and that's going to give you a total score for each of those sections. And then I'm going to pass it off to Timothy to keep it going.
Yes, so this is the representation portion of the scorecard. So we like to be fair and say that we want to give credit when credit is due. So during the process, we will have the scorecard with us, and we'll go through the curriculum to see if these institutions were actually being culturally responsive in their curriculum. So if you look on the screen, you see the statement numbers will be to the left, and then you see attempts. So we'll document whether, okay, they have tried to at least adhere to some cultural aspects of this particular group. So we want to make a note of that. And to the right, you will see is the attempt problematic and why. Oftentimes they don't actually, they want to give they want to be culturally responsive in face value, but not in depth. So oftentimes when we were actually doing this process back then, there were a lot of instances where they were trying to be culturally responsive, but they weren't really getting into the nitty gritties of it. For example, they will probably say that the most common one is a mathematical problem when one, instead of just saying coins or money, they will throw in tacos or enchiladas or whatever other, or just use culturally items to kind of explain this sort of problem. But then you have to ask yourself, is that really being culturally responsive, or are you just trying to slap a sticker or or just trying to pass as if it is culturally responsive, just so you won't hear any blowback from organizations or whatnot. So that's basically what this entire image represents. Do we keep going? Next slide. Yeah, so this is just basically the same slide, the space below, the attempts, you view the curriculum, you see whether or not if they're actually adhering to the guidelines based on the scorecard, and if they're adhering to, if they're trying to be culturally responsive, if they're honestly trying to do it, or if they're just trying to pass through and not kind of receive any sort of criticism from outside organizations that may question whether they're adhering to the promises of the community as a whole. And this basically here, so this is the kind of the guideline scorecard of this is how you're going to score whether or not this entire curriculum was culturally responsive or not. So if you see to the left, you see culturally destructive, and you see the scores down below, and it's from culturally destructive all the way to culturally responsive. A lot of the curriculums that we evaluated during the process of the scorecard, we found out to be very culturally destructive to culturally insufficient in a lot of cases. So again, this is just basically a guideline to evaluating the curriculum using the scorecard as that navigating tool. And you have some statements below to kind of help you along the way as to whether this curriculum was, again, adhering to any cultural responsibility or not.
Thank you. And this slide is just bringing it all together. You're going to put the scores into the tally. You're going to take your total and go to the interpretation section. You're going to find your score in this interpretation section, and that's the type of curriculum you have. It's going to be somewhere between culturally destructive and culturally responsive. All right, so our very last few slides here is just what happens after you finish scoring. The point of this is not just to score and say, oh man, we've got a culturally destructive curriculum, but there are additional things that can happen. So one, you want to debrief with your team. What was the process like? If this is your first time working with communities, working with families, what was that process like, et cetera? If it were family and community organizers, first times working with schools, what was that process like as well? And then consider sharing your results with us. So we are compiling evaluation scores. You can share them under your name or anonymously. It's just to get a sense of how curriculum is stacking up across the country. And then you can choose your course of action. On the EJ-ROC website, and there's also a link there, there is a toolkit of a bunch of different options that you can take once you get to the part where you've done the score, you've done the evaluations, and you're thinking about next steps. It's called the Next Steps Toolkit, and it's at the very bottom of the website. So when you go there, you'll see the STEAM scorecard, the ELA version, and at the very bottom, the toolkit. So right before we end, I just want to briefly go into the chat. I know this was like a super quick presentation, but about 45 minutes was all that we had. I just want to say that if you have questions in here, what we'll do is if they have not already been answered, we can compile them into a Q&A document and send them out, or maybe film a short video that answers some of these questions. And So don't think that if you have a question here and it hasn't been answered that you won't get an answer. We will get back to you as long as it's in this Q&A chat. Another place to leave feedback is also through the webinar evaluation. At the very top right corner of the screen, you'll see in bright green text webinar evaluation. It takes 2 to 3 minutes to do it. It would be so helpful to us if you fill this out. Essentially just lets us know how we did and gives us feedback on what you would have liked to see more of, or what you would like us to do differently, or what you absolutely loved. And there's also a space there to tell us anything you want in regards to the scorecard. So if there's like additional questions that didn't come up through the Q&A, or just comments that you felt like you couldn't make within this space, you can definitely do it through the evaluation form. And before I close us out, I really want to show so much appreciation to our think tank members who really assembled and did this work. It was very challenging work, very difficult work, and they were phenomenal. And I just want to, again, recognize and highlight all of them because it was so incredible working with them to come up with this scorecard. I also want to give folks maybe 30 seconds each to a minute to kind of close us out if there's anything that you want to share. No pressure if you don't though, but I do want to leave the opportunity open. If anyone wants to kind of say any last thoughts, share any resources, if they should follow you on Twitter, if they should go to your website, like this is a great time because all of these folks, they do incredible work. You want to be following them. You want to be leaned in and checked into what they're doing. Anybody want to share a couple last thoughts or just share like how people can get in contact with you?
I want to say thank you. That's first and foremost to all the folks who have led the work, including folks who have recently passed, plus Wendy Menard. And then secondly, I want to add that the CRSC working group, which is also under the NYU Metro Center Hub, is going to take a lot of this work and develop it into a CRSC facilitators guide that allows us to have the conversations in your schools to help build the equity teams to assure that we can have a much better conversation around accountability, especially that's more people-centered. So be on the lookout for that. And of course, feel free to, look out for any of us, ask us questions and, ask the team questions as well. I'm available. But other than that, thank you all so much.
Anybody else?
Well, I would like to thank Leah and everyone for allowing me to be a part of the project. It was a real eye-opener in terms of what exactly we were trying to do. This hasn't really been attempted before. So it was truly an eye-opener. Oftentimes you don't really, as we were doing this project, I often kind of reflect on my education upbringing and the way that I was taught, the way that I was learned. And you don't, in this kind of culture, in this environment that we have now in the schools, is more, you feel more or less that we're preparing students and children to take tests and to prepare for examinations rather than actual learning. And what are they learning? Who are they learning from? Who wrote the materials that they're learning? Are they reflected within the curriculum? And it's a really challenging process, but it is very rewarding. And it was truly an eye-opener. So I do want to thank everyone who was patient enough for allowing me to be a part of the process.
Thank you so much. Last call. I also want to bring your attention. Megan just dropped in the chat. Thank you, Megan, so much for like moderating the Q&A and all of that and sharing the screen for us. But if you want to join the EJ-ROC listserv, you can contact us by following that email right at the bottom, nyu-ejroc@nyu.edu. Again, if you want to work with us to maybe learn more about what is CRSC STEAM, since that part got a little bit shortened, or facilitating a scoring party, or just having more conversation, feel free to connect with us. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful Thursday. And again, thank you to all the panelists. I really appreciate all of you. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.